Welcome back to Science Horror. This week I'm going to read the second part of the story I read last week, called The Tulpa. Cheshire turned out to consist of a bunch of farms and a few rows of houses. If I had to guess, I'd say there weren't more than 2,000 people in the whole place, and probably a lot less than that. We tried to find the exact places where the mutilations had occurred, but there wasn't really enough information to go on in the article. "I sometimes go to the little shop here when my deliveries don't turn up on time," said Rupert. "This place has a shop?" I said incredulously. "Yes, but it's tiny, only sells essentials. I'll show you." He wasn't exaggerating. The shop was no more than a few shelves containing bread, cheese and sausage, plus some tin food, and a little counter that lacked even a cash register. Seeing it was like stepping back in time. In the window of the shop we found a handwritten poster with a crudely printed copy of one of the photographs from the newspaper article. I couldn't tell what it was saying. We were standing inside the shop, wondering what was in a can of some sort of meat, when 3 local men walked in. The tallest had a thick black beard and tattoos on his neck. When he saw Rupert, he seemed to immediately take offence. He began to point angrily and started ranting in Romanian. The shopkeeper, a stout middle-aged woman, explained to us in broken English. "Radu says you do the mutilations," she said affably. "Your dog. Crazy dog, not normal." "I haven't got any dogs," Rupert protested. "Let's get out of here," I said. "No, I'll not have this," said Rupert. He turned to the black-bearded man. "I don't have any dogs," he said. The man only became angrier, gesticulating wildly. The other 2 men with him were nodding. "We're leaving," I said, physically dragging Rupert by the arm towards the door. As we left the shop, the man, Radu, drew his finger across his neck, as though slitting his throat. The meaning was pretty clear. "I haven't got a dog," shouted Rupert over his shoulder as I bundled him out of the shop. "You might not have a dog, but what you apparently do have is a lot worse," I hissed. "What am I going to do?" said Rupert wildly, when we'd got out of earshot of the men. "We'll come back here at night with a gun," I said. "If there's anything prowling about, whether Tulpa or wolf or something else, we'll kill it before it can do any more harm." That night we went back to the village in Rupert's car, Rupert armed with a shotgun, and I with a night vision scope that Rupert had bought off the internet a week ago. It seemed to me that if there had been 3 attacks in 2 weeks, our chances of encountering whatever was killing the animals were fairly good. Truth be told, I wasn't sure I bought Rupert's story. It was entirely possible that he had simply lost his mind. Then again, if anyone could have accidentally created a monster from his own thoughts, Rupert would certainly have been the man to do it. Either way, I felt it was best to keep him busy and away from the machine that had led to his morbid state of mind one way or another in the first place. I was therefore fully prepared to spend 2 weeks staking out the village if necessary. My idea was to find the largest field of sheep and park the car next to that. But Rupert argued that if the Tulpa was hiding in the forest, it would probably enter the village along a particular track, so we parked the car there instead, somewhat hidden from the village by the trees. Probably the villagers would have discovered us if we'd parked by the field in any case, so it seemed for the best. We agreed to take it in turns to sleep, but in practice, neither of us could get to sleep at all, and I began to think it would make more sense for both of us to temporarily turn nocturnal while we conducted the search. On the first night we saw nothing out of the ordinary, neither the second. While checking the news the morning after our second stakeout, we discovered another mutilation had occurred, this time of an even far worse nature than the first 3. A young woman had been found with her head smashed and her eyes removed. Rupert almost collapsed. He said he didn't see how he could go on living with this on his conscience. I tried to reason with him. I told him he could not be sure that his creation was responsible, and even if it was, the whole thing was an accident and not his fault. He could not have foreseen the results of his experiments, I pointed out. His intentions had only been good. These arguments didn't carry much weight with him. He continued to blame himself. The one argument that did strike home was that he needed to go on living so that he could find and kill the monster. It took all of my persuasive skill to prevent him from going to the police. I was quite certain of the outcome if he were to attempt to inform the police that a tulpa created from his nightmares was responsible for the killings. At best they would consign him to a psychiatric facility. At worst, they would assume him to be personally responsible for the killings. For our third night, we took a chance and parked on the same road, but closer to the village. Our car was visible for anyone who cared to look, but apparently, country folk aren't prone to wandering about in the middle of the night, so we thought we could get away with it. Our car was parked facing the forest, since we expected the tulpa to emerge from that direction. For this reason we didn't see the men approaching us from the village. Around 2 a.m, we nearly jumped out of our skins when the rear windscreen suddenly smashed. The same 3 men we had seen in the village shop, led by the one they called Radu, had crept up on us from behind. They surrounded the car, pulling the door handles, which were mercifully locked, and shouting imprecations in Romanian. Radu, however, apparently knew more English than he had let on. "Murderers," he shouted. "You kill her." Following this, he smashed the windscreen with a metal bar. I was sitting in the driver's seat. I turned on the engine and put the car into gear as quickly as my shaking hands could manage. The driver's side window was smashed by Radu's crowbar, and Radu began reaching in to try to pull me out of the car. At that moment I managed to reverse into the middle of the road. Then I saw that one of the men had a gun. I put the car into first gear and we lurched forwards. I heard a gunshot ring out, and it sounded as though a bullet had penetrated the car. "Are you okay?" I said to Rupert. "Are you shot?" "I'm fine," he said. "Go." We quickly pulled away and into the darkness of the forest. Another shot rang out, but this time it went wide. Soon we had left the men behind and we were proceeding as fast as I dared to drive down a muddy forest track. I was very aware that crashing into a tree might be just as bad for us as getting shot, so I kept the speed steady and moderate. "They think I murdered that girl," said Rupert, aghast. "They're just local nutters, don't worry about it," I said. "Unfortunately, we've made ourselves look rather suspicious, hanging about at night like this. We need to explain the situation to them," he said. "I mean to the villagers, the more reasonable ones." "That hardly sounds like a good idea," I said. "I'm not sure they've even seen a cash register, and you're going to start trying to tell them about matter assemblers and tulpas. It's just not going to go down well." "Then we'll tell them we thought a wolf did it and we were looking for the wolf," he suggested. "Why would they believe us? The best thing we can do is just get out of here. That lot were ready to kill us. I'm not going back there." The track was beginning to narrow as it ascended slowly into the hills. We had no real idea of where it went, although it was heading in the general direction of Rupert's castle. The wheels were increasingly slipping on the gravelly surface, and I started to worry that the men would catch up with us, if indeed they had followed us. "Rupert, this is getting steeper and steeper," I said. "We're going to have to turn around." "We can't do that," he said, glancing behind us nervously. "They might be right behind us for all we know." "They might have gone home," I said. "They weren't using flashlights. Who wants to trek through a forest at 2 a.m? "They weren't using flashlights because they wanted to creep up on us," he said. "That doesn't mean they don't have them." He had a point. "What about if I try to roll the car with the engine off as much as possible?" I suggested. "If we see any light, I'll turn around." "For pity's sake, just try to keep on going for a bit," he said. "God only knows what they'll do if they catch us." We carried on up the hill for another few minutes, but then the track became so steep that no matter what I did, I couldn't get the Skoda up it. "We'll either have to turn around or else get out and walk," I said. "If we turn around and we see them, we'll just have to duck and speed up, try to run through them, or else get out and run into the forest if there's time." We sat there discussing our options for perhaps a few minutes, Rupert nervously scanning the dark forest for signs of the men. We had more or less decided to try to reverse the car back down the track and try to turn around somewhere, when Rupert gave a sudden yelp. "Look," he said. Somewhere behind the trees we could see the lights of torches sweeping the forest. They must have taken a shortcut, I said. We need to abandon the car. If we leave the track, they'll never find us in the dark. We got out, trying to make as little noise as possible, and started pushing our way into the trees at the side of the track. Stupidly, in our anxiety to escape, we completely forgot about the gun, leaving it in the car. The going was pretty difficult, and we were constantly splintering through tree branches and getting scraped. We were fortunate that there was at least a half moon, because with no moon at all, I doubt that we would have been able to see even our hands in front of our faces. We gradually lost sight of the lights of the men's torches behind us, but we had little idea of where we were, and we could see almost nothing. We thought we were heading roughly in the right direction, although at that pace it might have taken us days to reach the castle, for all we knew. Our only hope was to reach the road that curved up the side of the mountain, further to the west. Eventually we emerged into a clearing, scratched and limping, after tripping over stones and roots numerous times, and we stood there in the moonlight, breathing heavily. "The castle should be somewhere up that way," said Rupert, pointing up the hill. Then something caught my ear. "Listen," I whispered. Rupert froze. "I don't hear anything," he said, after a pause. I motioned for him to be silent, then after a while he heard it too. Something was crashing through the undergrowth towards us. "It's the Tulpa," he said, in a half sob. "We're finished." "Shh," I hissed. Whatever it was definitely progressing steadily towards us. It sounded big and powerful, easily smashing the many thin intersecting tree branches out of its way, the same branches that had given us so many problems. "That way," I said, pointing up the hill. We started pushing through the branches to the north of the clearing. We found the going was a little bit easier in that direction, except the ground was very steep in places, and we had to scramble up some sections on all fours. After what seemed like an eternity, but was probably more like half an hour, we emerged from the trees to find ourselves at the top of a steep, rocky slope. Lacking any real alternative, we began to make our way down it, clambering over the rocks, but it gradually became steeper and steeper. The rocks were of some sort of volcanic or metamorphic type, and were extremely jagged and sharp. After cutting myself twice on their jagged edges, I shouted to Rupert, who had got a little ahead of me, to stop. "This is ridiculous," I said. "We're going to fall off a cliff out here if we don't bleed to death first. We're going to have to stop here for the rest of the night." "Are you joking?" said Rupert. "The monster is out there somewhere, and there are 3 crazed locals searching for us." In the moonlight I could see his face was streaked with tears, and his voice sounded uneven, on the verge of hysterics. "Nothing and no one will find us if we stay put," I said. "We can hardly even see 10 meters in this gloom. The rocks are getting steeper. I think they're leading to a cliff edge. It'll get light around 5 or something, and then we can see where we're going. That's only a couple of hours." He wiped his face with his arm. "Okay, that's all true," he said. "All right, we'll stay here." We arranged ourselves on the rocks as best we could. The main problem was that they were cold, and when we lay on them we began to shiver uncontrollably. We managed to find some plant matter to stuff underneath us, and that helped a bit. Neither of us were able to sleep at all, although we were tired. After the longest hour or 2 of my life, I thought I could discern a faint lightening of the horizon, and half an hour later I was sure of it. The sun seemed to rise incredibly slowly, but at a certain point there was enough light to see by, and we were able to peer down into the valley below and get a vague idea of where we were, or at least how to get down. We had given up hope of finding the castle, and by then only wanted to find civilization, although if possible not the village of Cheshire, and then get back to the castle somehow via the roads. We started making our way down the hill. Progress was slow, lacking any real path, and we were forced to walk considerably further along the ridge that we found ourselves on before we could find any way down at all. By 10 we were still making our way downwards, and were only about halfway to the floor of the valley. Having been thoroughly chilled in the early hours of the morning, we now began to get very hot in the sun, and I started to worry that we'd suffer serious dehydration before we made it down. We could see some farms and houses down below in the valley, so far away that they looked like tiny children's toys. We were constantly running into the webs of enormous spiders, but that didn't bother me as much as my mounting thirst. I picked up a stick and used it to clear the spider webs in front of me as we descended. By around noon, we finally arrived at a farmhouse, and we knocked on their door to ask for some water. No one answered, which was perhaps just as well, but outside we found a tap, and we were able to drink our fill. From there we had a long walk back to the castle. It was 5 o'clock by the time we finally arrived. The last couple of miles were extremely hard, because again we became very thirsty due to the exertion of walking up the hill without water in the heat of the sun. I was incredibly relieved to finally stagger through the castle gates. We made a swift meal out of some old bread and cheese and a bit of cured sausage, washed down with a port and a great deal of water. Then I ran a bath in one of the several old but serviceable bathrooms and soaked the filth and dried blood off myself. After that I got into bed and fell asleep, fervently hoping Rupert was doing the same. The next day I awoke very late to find a thunderous storm taking place outside. I found Rupert in one of the castle's studies, sipping sherry, wearing a dressing gown. "There are cars outside," he said apathetically. "I don't know what they want." I looked through the window and indeed, outside the gates at the end of the short drive that led from the gates to the castle, 3 cars were parked at odd angles, headlights on in the pouring rain. "You'd better get dressed," I said. "We might need to get out of here quickly." "I won't be expelled from my own castle," he said. "Then prepare yourself for a fight," I said. Over the next few hours, more and more cars gathered at the end of the drive. Finally, around noon, they rang the bell next to the gate. We didn't answer it. After 10 minutes of repeated ringing, the bell stopped. All was quiet for about 20 minutes. Then we heard an enormous crash, mixed with rolling thunder. A car had smashed through the gate. The other cars began to follow and pulled up facing the castle, headlights glaring. Men with guns began to get out of the cars and stand around in the rain. I recognized Radu. He seemed to be their leader. There was a smattering of women too, some with guns, others standing at the back, chanting something. Some of them had placards written in Romanian. What they said, I don't know. "We really need to get out of here," I said. "They look like they mean business." "I told you I'm not leaving," said Rupert. "You should leave. It's me they probably want." "I can't leave you here to a baying mob," I said. We tried to look up translations of some Romanian sentences on the internet, but the satellite was down. The storm must have affected it. I was hoping we could prepare a few sentences along the lines of, "We did not kill the woman or the animals." Then came the knock at the door, or rather, a massive pounding. It sounded like multiple people were hitting the door with bats. Still we didn't answer, and after a few minutes we heard the sound of a window smashing downstairs. "There aren't any bars on the windows, I take it," I said. Rupert shook his head. I could see he was scared. "The windows are mostly made with metal latticework and it's pretty soft. They'll easily break through it. Can we hide somewhere?" "I wouldn't know where," said Rupert. Soon we heard the sound of many footsteps coming up the staircase. I grabbed Rupert and yanked him towards the door. "We need to go to the upper floors at least," I said. "We need time to think. Maybe there's somewhere we can hide up there." He nodded and we made for the staircase. For the next 10 minutes we listened to the sound of them thoroughly and systematically searching the first floor below. When we heard footsteps coming up the stairs that joined the first floor to the second, we retreated to the 3rd floor. That was as high as we could go without going to one of the turrets. On the 3rd floor we frantically discussed what to do. "We could tie together bed sheets and climb out the window. It's that or they'll kill us, or worse," I said. Finally Rupert, scared half out of his wits, agreed to abandon the castle. We gathered sheets from several different rooms. "The room where the Tulpa smashed the window, there are bushes growing below it," said Rupert. "That at least break our fall if the sheets tear." We hastened to the room and began tying the sheets together and lowering them out the window. After tying one end, to the leg of the little table Rupert had set up in front of the window. It wasn't heavy enough to hold our weight, but it was too big to fall through the gap in the metal trellis of the window, so it would do the trick. We were almost ready to attempt to descend to the bushes when they broke through the door. A crowd of angry men began shouting and pointing and waving guns. They largely ignored me, but Rupert got pushed into the middle of a circle of screaming men. A gypsy woman was there too, wailing at the top of her voice. I guessed she was the mother of the murdered girl. Rupert pathetically tried to ask if anyone spoke English. The fact is that many people do speak English in Transylvania, but either we happened to be out of luck or they were feigning ignorance. Their leader, Radu, stepped forwards to confront Rupert. He was brandishing a large ugly knife. My attention had been largely taken up by the events unfolding in front of me. Two men were blocking my attempts to break through the circle. My blood was up, and I fully intended to stand by Rupert and try to reason with the villagers, if only they had allowed me. When I saw that huge knife, I figured only violent self-defense could possibly save us, and I cursed myself for not having thought of asking Rupert whether he had any more guns. As I looked around for some kind of weapon, my gaze settled on something almost unfathomably hideous. A face was poking out from the top of the fireplace, upside down. Two staring lidless eyes were embedded in a head that resembled a plate of raw meat. Most of the thing's face was mercifully hidden by the chimney, but those two nightmarish eyes were regarding the proceedings with eerie interest. Suddenly there was a huge flash of lightning and the lights went out. Without lights, the room was in semi-darkness, illuminated only by the drab, storm-dimmed daylight from the one small window. To my further horror, I saw Rupert was wrestling with Radu apparently trying to stab Rupert, while Rupert tried to force the knife away. I started forwards, but the two men grabbed my arms, jabbering at me in Romanian or some local dialect. I watched helplessly as the knife plunged into Rupert's neck. He sank to the ground, gurgling horribly. At that moment there was a kind of yelp, and the thing slithered out from the fireplace and lunged at the men. A cry of terror went up, and the crowd sprang back as they laid eyes on the horrible creature. Indeed, it resembled an ape, but entirely without skin and with a horrible gaping open round mouth filled with rows of pointed teeth. The thing made straight for Radu, and opening its mouth impossibly wide, it fastened its teeth onto his face. There was a grotesque sound of ripping flesh, and Radu's lifeless and faceless body fell to the ground. The crowd bolted for the door, pushing each other aside in their desperate attempts to flee the room. I've never seen a room empty so quickly. No one checked on Radu, but it was obvious that he was dead. The last person to leave the room shut the door firmly behind him, and I could hear a mad stampede of feet heading for the stairs, yelling and screaming. The monster ran to Rupert's lifeless body and incredibly began to caress his hair, making soft, sad, whimpering sounds. As I stood there, frozen with fear, it slowly looked up at me, almost beseechingly, and in those terrifying lidless eyes, I saw only sadness. Then I noticed something else. Its eyes, although without eyelids, bore a curious resemblance to Rupert's. The door was abruptly flung open, and there stood the gypsy woman, the woman whose daughter had been murdered. She had a gun. Before I had time to even react, she unloaded 2 shots directly into the body of the beast. It fell to the floor, a dark reddish blood mingling with the pool of blood from Rupert's wounds. She looked at me with a strange mixture of triumph, misery and contempt. Then she turned and left. I was in a state of shock, and for a while I stood there gaping at the scene before me. Perhaps 10 minutes passed before I was able to pull myself together enough to leave the room, shaking like a leaf, and pour myself a glass of stiff spirits in the study downstairs. It was then that I realised there was a smell of smoke in the air. I rushed downstairs and was met with an inferno of flame. Evidently they had set fire to the place as they left. I ran to the back of the castle, and there I was able to get out through a rear door. Running around to the front, I saw flames were already illuminating some of the windows on the first floor. It could only be a matter of time before the whole place went up. I almost tried to call the fire brigade, but I stopped myself before I dialed the number. Perhaps whatever went on in that castle was best left to the flames. I got into my car and drove out through the broken gates, and I didn't stop till I was back in Cluj. From there, I took the first flight back to London. In the following weeks, I scanned the news in Romania compulsively. There was nothing about Rupert or his castle, but after a few weeks I came across an article in a newspaper from Cluj, which I was able to automatically translate. It talked about the animal mutilations and the murder, and it said the police had identified the culprit using DNA. I knew what the article was going to say. The beast had been created by Rupert. Its eyes had borne an uncanny resemblance to Rupert's, and perhaps it had his DNA. I was sure the article was going to finger Rupert himself as the murderer, but I was wrong. The murderer, it said, was none other than a certain Radu L, a local who had died in a fire at a nearby castle. Following that was a fragmentary history of Radu's previous criminal convictions and his disturbing childhood. The Tulpa must have attempted to escape from the window, but had given up and had been hiding in that room the whole time, retreating to the fireplace whenever someone entered. There was no way it could have got out of the window and then scaled the wall and got back in again. The poor thing was no killer. It had killed only when it saw its father murdered before its eyes. The thing we heard in the forest was probably just a wild hog or a bear. The only other possibility would be that the Tulpa was possessed of a miraculous climbing ability and really had committed the killings. But the police, on finding incomprehensible DNA in the murdered girl's wounds, had decided to blame the murder and the mutilations on the usual suspect, who was now deceased. Either way, no further killings were reported. I can only hope that no one tries to follow Rupert's research. Thank you for listening. My name's John and you've been listening to the Science Horror YouTube channel. Next week I'm going to read a story I've written called The Reality Serum. It's a story about a doctor who invents an injectable serum which enables people to see reality as it really is. It turns out that seeing reality as it really is not something you actually want to do. I hope to see you again next Monday. If you liked this video, please consider clicking the like button and subscribing if you haven't already subscribed. Thanks again. Until next time, sleep well.